All right, I think I'm going to kick us off here because I know we have a lot of great content to cover. My name is Andrea Gilmore-Bukowski, and I feel very fortunate to co-direct the Embrace AD/ADRD Roybal Center with Joe Gogler, with the excellent expertise of Nancy Hodgson and Laura Gitlin, as well as members of the leadership team who lead the Behavioral Intervention and Development Core. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today. As you can see, our topic is about why and how behavioral interventions work. In the process of soliciting letters of intent for our Roybal Center for various projects, we really started to think that an introductory webinar on this topic might be really valuable. But also in talking together, we've been reflecting on, even for those of us who maybe have been involved in intervention science and behavioral interventions for a while, this is content that you really can't revisit often enough. Talking about mechanisms of action, why it is, how it is that behavioral interventions work, is a really complicated topic. So, the webinar today is going to offer an introduction to that, really talking about what a mechanism of action is, why mechanisms of action matter, and how they relate to intervention components and outcomes as a step one. So we're really happy to have you all here with us. We will have time at the end for questions and answers as well. So think of questions as you're hearing folks present today. Next slide, please. Prior to us kicking off, we do just want to make sure that we acknowledge funding that is provided from the National Institute on Aging through the P30 Roybal AD/ADRD Roybal mechanism, and also acknowledge that the content we're presenting is that of the presenters and doesn't necessarily represent the views of the National Institutes of Health. Thanks again for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to Nancy now.
Thanks. We are very happy to be simultaneously launching 4 guidance documents today. We'll be posting the link soon in chat. And the 4 guidance documents are as follows. The first, part 1, is a overall guidance document talking about mechanisms of action for behavioral interventions, particularly focused on dementia family caregivers. It's followed by 3 other supportive guidance documents, one focused on the relationship between fidelity and mechanisms in behavioral intervention research, the third on tailoring and mechanisms, and the fourth on testing mechanisms in technology-based interventions. The latter 3 guidance documents are very closely related to mechanisms of action, and we felt they were deserving of their own guidance documents. We're going to talk more about how to access these documents and also how you'd like us to cover the content of those latter 3 guidance documents later in the webinar. Next slide, please. But the focus of today's webinar is really to define mechanisms of action, distinguish what mechanisms of action are from the intervention components and outcomes, identify core mechanisms, theoretical frameworks, and validated measures, particularly those used in dementia caregiving intervention studies, and then apply the guidance on specifying, measuring, and reporting mechanisms, including some considerations for fidelity, tailoring, and technology-driven interventions. These, again, are the focus of the later forthcoming guidance documents, but we'll address some of those issues hopefully in the Q&A. But let's get started. So let's begin with the foundational question of what do we mean when we talk about mechanisms of action? In this webinar and in the guidance document, we're referring to mechanism of action as the processes that must change in order for an intervention to produce a meaningful outcome. And it's worth distinguishing mechanism of action from its related concepts. And the language really matters here. Intervention components are really describing what the intervention actually does. And I'm going to use an example here from the NYU Caregiver Intervention Study. I'm using this example from one of our earlier webinars from Dr. Roth, and we're going to use this example later on today. But let's say the intervention components might be focused on strengthening social support for a family caregiver. Then there's the mechanism. How and why do those components work? In our example, these intervention components might be hypothesized to increase the caregiver's perception of emotional support. And finally, the outcome is what changes as a result. In this example, it would be reducing caregiver depression. So this three-part framework, component, mechanism, and outcome, is the backbone of what we're going to be discussing today. So please keep that in mind as we go along. Next slide, please. So why does this all matter? Well, the bulleted list here lays out some of the reasons. But let me start with a striking statistic. So in 2018, a systematic review by Edmondson and colleagues of NIH-funded behavioral interventions showed that only 3% of these trials actually tested the hypothesized mechanisms of behavioral change. 3%. And when we start to look at dementia studies, intervention studies, it's probably even a lower percent than that. Um, and so, that's a shocking statistic. Um, and so this tells us something important about the field. We haven't built the habit of asking why an intervention works, only whether it works, and that distinction is critical. If we don't understand the mechanism, we can't replicate interventions accurately, and we can't adapt them for new populations or settings. Practitioners can't make informed decisions about which intervention components to prioritize, and we lose the opportunity to improve upon what we've built. And funders, NIH in particular, is increasingly expecting mechanistic thinking. Um, so even if you're not formally testing a mechanism in your current study, building a conceptual model or prepositions or proposing presumed mechanisms in grant applications is now increasingly being expected. And so to quote on this slide from our guidance document we're releasing today, we hope we capture that expectation well here. And so mechanism specification really strengthens everything that we do, and we hope to establish that as a scientific, core scientific practice. Next slide, please. So aligning that with our basic understanding of what a mechanism is, now let's try to fit it into a broader structure of an intervention. And the key principle here is aligning that every intervention component should map to at least one mechanism, and every mechanism should connect to outcomes. And we think of it as a logical chain with time flowing from left to right. So if we start with the intervention component, which activates the mechanism, the process that changes, then that leads to the outcomes, proximal outcome or then distal outcome. And in our example here, the intervention would involve, let's say, 6 sessions focused on strengthening social support through counseling, support groups, on-call consultations. And the mechanism is the increase in satisfaction with one's social support network. Therefore, the outcome we could perhaps expect would be depression improvement, measured by geriatric depression scale, or improvement in caregiver burden, measured by the Zarit burden scale. These are downstream from the mechanistic change. And so hopefully that logic begins to make sense, because now we're going to transition to Joe, who's going to further talk about this causal pathway and mechanism specification to illustrate other examples. I'll turn it over
Yeah,
to Joe.
thank you so much, Nancy. Again, appreciate everyone being here today. We wanted to offer this as Dr. Gilmore Bykowski had mentioned earlier. First and foremost, as an introductory overview of what mechanisms are and why they're important to try to maybe advance understanding and application of mechanisms in how we design and test our various types of interventions. But as you know, Andrea had indicated too, I think even those of us that have been attempting to immerse ourselves in this area have also found reviewing and continually thinking about what these different concepts mean really important to our own work, and then of course the broader work of in this case the Embrace Roybal Center and likely the Roybal Network in general. And for those of you that don't know, a methodological area of interest is mine, in addition to intervention science, is implementation science. And I teach an interdisciplinary doctoral seminar in implementation science every other year. So I just finished teaching it again this past spring. And one resource I came across that we reviewed in the class I thought was really, really helpful and led me to reflect on its application as maybe a useful heuristic or tool for the Roybal work that we're trying to do in advance. And specifically, this is the causal pathway diagram. This came out of a chapter from a really, really great book that was published in 2024 on implementation science by Pers Nielsen. Dr. Nielsen is really known for advancing our understanding of theories, models, and frameworks of implementation science, but has also published and edited a couple of really, really helpful textbooks in implementation science. And this was one of the most useful chapters I found out of the most recent book. And essentially, like intervention science, behavioral intervention science, implementation science has also grappled with the need to better understand how and why implementation strategies are effective. And you could take this figure and really switch out implementation strategy and substitute it with intervention or intervention component. And I think you'll see why it's potentially useful in what we're talking about here. Um, as Nancy had mentioned, the core elements of the causal pathway diagram are one, the implementation and or intervention component strategy. Two is the mechanism. You see that the star there in the middle. And then third are the outcomes. And for simplicity's sake, I think really focusing on those three elements are most important. Now, that being said, certainly with implementation, perhaps in our own behavioral intervention work, there are some other key elements to consider when trying to understand how and why an intervention works or is efficacious. For example, moderators. The very useful metaphor that Meza and colleagues use in the chapter are thinking of moderators and preconditions as almost a light switch. Um, a moderator is like a dimmer on a light switch. So if one incorporates a moderator variable, that obviously will influence the strength of the relationship, in this case, between an implementation or intervention component and a mechanism, and then eventually an outcome. Whereas a precondition is, again, a light switch, but on and off, meaning that this is a condition that is necessary in order for the intervention to influence a mechanism. And why I wanted to emphasize this is we often don't always think of not only if not moderators in our overall conceptualization of the mechanistic pathways of our interventions, but often preconditions as well. What is absolutely needed in order for this intervention to work, and more specifically, for this intervention or intervention component to influence a mechanism and then eventually an outcome. Um, why, we really want to just focus on outcomes in a more simple fashion here. I think most often we're dealing with proximal outcomes unless we have the ability to follow interventions effects over longer periods of time. But certainly when considering the context of implementation science, distal outcomes often can be quite important when we're thinking of key implementation outcomes like sustainability. And of course, that's important in our work too as behavioral intervention scientists. But nonetheless, I think it's important to note that I think for our purposes here, we're really focusing on intervention, component, mechanism, outcome as the pathway to really establish and test in the context of our intervention science. Next slide, please. So this table I thought was really helpful, again, from this Mesa chapter, in that it offers, I think, some really helpful definitions for us to think about. Specifically mechanism in and of itself, which is the process through which an implementation strategy, or for our purposes, an intervention or intervention component, operates to an effect an outcome. And then also you see some of the other outcomes here. I did highlight moderator, a factor that can strengthen or weaken the influence of an intervention component or implementation strategy, first on a mechanism, and then potentially from mechanism to outcome as well. So these are all key definitions to consider when we're trying to adopt more of a mechanistic perspective in our intervention science. Next slide, please. I wanted to provide some actual real world examples of work that we're doing, as well as others have done in the past, to really highlight how this mechanistic thinking can influence a conceptualization of intervention benefit. And so this is our recently completed R21 project called Home Alone. Home Alone is designed to provide an intervention for older people with cognitive impairment who live alone, essentially. We felt that this was an important gap in the science of dementia care. It's of increasing importance to identify services and supports for the larger number of people who are living alone with dementia. And so, what we did when conceptualizing this intervention, again, trying to adopt a mechanistic approach, is we first identified the two components of the home alone intervention. First, behavioral activation, which is a key component of the home alone intervention, and two, environmental modification. What we hypothesized was that the behavioral activation component would influence the mechanism of increasing pleasant and fulfilling activities and engagement for these individuals. Two, environmental modification would reduce environmental press. And again, a key point of a mechanistic perspective is, in addition to conceptualizing this, we have measured this in our intervention and we are testing the association between these components and these mechanisms. And as you can see on the right-hand side, these are the three outcomes we expect that really both mechanisms to influence: improving social well-being, reducing functional dependence, and maintaining or improving cognition. So this is one example that's underway that we're testing. And the second example, which again is on the next slide, thanks, Katie. And you heard Dr. Hodgson allude to this, is the New York University caregiver intervention. We thought this was a really great example of how mechanisms have been actually empirically tested in a long-running randomized controlled trial of a comprehensive support program for spousal caregivers of people living with dementia. Again, I really encourage you, if you haven't, to watch Dr. Ross' Embrace webinar that was done several months ago. He really goes in depth in how this was done in the testing, but we wanted to revisit it here briefly to again show you a real world example of how the NYUCI really adopted a mechanistic approach when really concerning social support being a key mechanism through which would drive benefits as it related, in this case, to caregiver depression as well as nursing home admission. Next slide, please. So this is how social support was measured as a mechanism in the NYUCI. You see a series of Likert type ratings were utilized to address actually various dimensions of social support. There was general social support, emotional support, and then also satisfied with more instrumental assistance related to social support. And again, these were considered as mechanisms in a subsequent longitudinal analysis of the NYUCI's effect and specifically mechanistic pathway to reducing caregiver depression and reducing care recipient nursing home admission. Next slide, please. And so here you see one example of an analytic model that David and the team conducted to better understand the effects of the NYUCI on the mechanism of support. And one model that emerged where there were significant pathways occurring were intervention, in this case, NYUCI, the Comprehensive Support Program versus usual care for spousal caregivers, increased satisfaction with social support, which then was empirically associated with reductions in depression over time. For those of you that aren't familiar, the NYCI collected longitudinal data. If memory serves, it might have been well over 10 years of data. Maybe more actually, more like 14 years, pardon me. So when you see change in these models, it's reflecting change over multiple years, not necessarily 6 months, 5 months, 12 months. So certainly, again, there's a significant amount of longitudinal trial data on which to examine the effects of the NYCI over time. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Hodgson here, and she's going to focus on some of the common theoretical frameworks to consider in the context of mechanistic perspectives, particularly in behavioral intervention work in aging. Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah, thanks. So, as you know, one of the most powerful tools we have as behavioral scientists is theory, and theoretical frameworks help us guide the specific factors that could influence behavior, understand why an intervention should work, and choosing the right the theoretical framework isn't just academic. It directly can shape which mechanisms we're going to target and how we design our interventions. And so I'm just going to walk us through five frameworks that we picked for the guidance document. We thought it would be helpful to have a few examples in the guidance document that we commonly see in our work, that come up and again in dementia caregiving research. And we provide some examples also in the guidance document in case that's helpful to you. So the first is a stress process model developed by Perlin and colleagues, which maps how primary stressors lead to subjective appraisal and ultimately to caregiver outcomes. It's one of the most widely used frameworks in our field, particularly for caregiving stress. That's briefly just presented here. The next is the social cognitive theory from Bandura, which emphasizes skill acquisition, caregiver mastery experiences, and how we build those self-efficacy skills, a person's belief in their own capacity to act effectively, again, very useful in our field for caregiving interventions. The caregiver behavioral theory, the cognitive behavioral theory, which focuses on identifying and challenging unhelpful thought patterns, activating new behaviors, and improving mood as a result, is another useful caregiving framework for our work. The competence environmental press framework is particularly relevant theory for targeting persons living with dementia and modifying the environment to fit between the person's abilities and the environmental demands. It can show how modifying the environment can also reduce caregiving burden. Very useful and common framework in our field. And finally, the dyadic care models that recognize that caregiving happens in a relationship, and so improving communication between the caregiver and the care receiver can enhance mutual understanding and coping. So these are five examples. But the main point we want to really emphasize here is that consistent application of theory across our intervention development, implementation, and evaluation really enhances the work and our effectiveness and makes our work more reproducible when we have a common language. Next slide. Another part of our guidance document, an important piece of and a challenge as well, is in measuring mechanisms and some key principles. So certainly understanding mechanisms conceptually is one part of the job, and then the other part is measurement. And many people we have helped is in this piece where many researchers get stuck, and it's really goes beyond the global outcomes, and and understanding why the outcome of depression, for example, has improved, how the specific cognitive, behavioral, or relational processes underlying our intervention were designed to change. And so some very basic principles that probably seem intuitive are sort of outlined here, that we need to use mechanistic specific measures rather than outcome scales alone, that we need to establish temporal ordering, that the logic of mediation requires that the mechanism changes before the outcome. So our measurement time points need to reflect that. Third, that testing mediation or moderation where feasible, as Joe was pointing out, allows us to draw causal inferences about mechanism. The fourth is that when we can use validated measures with demonstrated sensitivity to change in our caregiver population, that's important. And I'll give some examples of some measures that we want to direct your attention to. And fifth is to match your measurement level to the mechanism, whether it's at the individual level, dyadic level, or environmental level. A particular valuable resource here is the NIH Science of Behavior Change Measures repository, and I would encourage you to explore that as you design your measurement strategy. Next slide. We have some concrete measures here of opportunities for measure in self-efficacy. We give some examples, and there's more examples in our guidance document, but we wanted to provide a few for you here. The revised scale for caregiving self-efficacy is widely used and a well-validated measure in caregiving populations. For knowledge, the Alzheimer's disease knowledge scale. For coping and emotional regulation, you have options like the perceived stress scale and the cognitive emotion regulation questionnaire. For social support, the medical outcomes study social support survey. And for dyadic relational processes, there's the relationship between caregiver and care recipient, like the dyadic relationship scale. But these are just starting points. Again, the Science of Behavior Change Measures repository has been specifically developed to expand and improve mechanisms, focused measurement. It promotes standardized measures, and it has a shared vocabulary across research groups and continues to grow through national and international collaboration. So I think what we want to again emphasize is that standardization matters here. When we are all measuring the same mechanisms with the same tools, we can compare findings and build cumulative knowledge and move our science forward more quickly, which is why we're all working together within these Roybal collaboratives. Next slide, please. So a couple other resources within our guidance documents include FAQs and also some core references. So within our FAQs, we've got some common questions that we receive often when advising investigators on pilot grants, or just common questions that we receive. Things like, can we have more than one mechanism? Which, of course, in our reality, we know we are testing often multi-component, multi-level interventions because we are tackling complex problems. And so, yes, it's important to think about multiple multiple mechanisms, and also to think about different mechanisms for different populations because it may not be the same mechanism that may work for different populations. And another important reason why this work is so important in our field. Another question is at what stage mechanisms can be tested, and really mechanisms can and should be tested at every stage. In stage 0, you're identifying which mechanisms to target and assessing whether they can be measured. And at stage 1, you're testing whether your intervention can actually change the hypothesized mechanisms. In stage 2, you could be formally testing your mediation. In stage 3, you could be seeing if mechanisms operate in real world conditions. And in stage 4, you're evaluating how organizations or system level factors might affect mechanism activation. Questions about whether mechanisms are required in NIH grant applications. I think, as I pointed out at the beginning, we're seeing this as increasingly important. Even if you're not formally testing mechanisms with mediation analysis, you really do need to include conceptual models and proposed presumed mechanisms. I think reviewers increasingly want to see your theory of change and why you think your intervention will work, certainly. And other questions about whether or not should mechanisms appear in trial outcomes publications. We've seen it in discussion sections of papers, but we're not seeing it earlier in papers. And so we want to encourage that even if you're not formally testing it in the main outcomes, it's important to be explicit and build this cumulative knowledge. Certainly, if you are having mediation findings, they can go into a main outcomes paper or follow-up mechanisms paper, but please, at a minimum, articulate what you expect to happen. We can certainly talk about that more in our Q&A. But we do have some guidance within our guidance document about how to include these in your dissemination of findings. Next slide, please. So all of our guidance documents have key references. There's exhaustive references that we probably could provide to you, but we really wanted to curate the references that we provided to you. So the first reference here is by Burke and colleagues. We certainly had Dr. Burke at one of our webinars, and he's introducing the climber model to us, and I highly recommend that you view that webinar, but this is the paper with the climber checklist. Next here, we've listed Dr. Gitlin and colleagues chapter, which focuses specifically on dementia caregiver interventions in the Handbook on Dementia Caregiving. Next is Gitlin and Saj's recently published Handbook in Intervention Silence, which is a comprehensive resource. The fourth reference here is the Edmondson Review that I referenced earlier. recent not recent, but 2018 systematic review. And then finally, the Wyman review, which examines a process evaluation in dementia caregiving interventions. It, um, and it's an interesting process evaluation that's closely related to examining mechanisms. So we've covered a lot of ground. I think we're going to open it up for Q&A, but first we wanted to pose a poll question to you. So the next slide, I think, or maybe the slide after it, but the next slide might have a link to the resources, and the slide after that might be your Zoom poll. Yeah, here we're providing a link to the resources and the guides. And the next is really asking you how you'd like to learn about our 3 forthcoming other guidance documents. So please help us decide how you'd like to receive that information.
Are you all seeing these results too? It's a little hard to tell.
Yeah,
No.
we can see that almost everyone has voted, Nancy, unless
Great.
we, the panelists, are going to vote. So, and I don't think we're going to. So,
Yeah.
it's good. Yep, yep.
Okay, very good. I have not, I am not seeing it, so maybe.
So it's literally, yeah, it's very interesting results. Thanks everyone for voting. It is 54% with like live and recorded
Oh, there
webinars,
it
40,
is. Okay.
yep, 46% with like pre-recorded micro learning sessions, brief video tutorials. So more or
Okay.
less just about half and half, which means
Oh.
we'll do both. We'll do both and see how it goes. So that's good.
Mhm.
Yep, yep.
That's wonderful.
Okay.
All right. Well, now we have a chance to really dive further into our discussion and hear what kind of questions you have. Questions and comments, because I want to emphasize too that these are living documents. We really are open to your feedback. We want to make sure that they're helpful to you, reaching you and the questions that you have about this field.
Yep. So I'll go ahead. I mean, I'm looking at the Q&A and I wanted to share this with everyone and on the panel. And again, Andrea, Nancy, Laura, I see Laura's joining us, Dr. Gitlin as well. If you want to type these answers in too, that would be great in the Q&A or chat. But this first question is this a really good one and an interesting one. To what extent are objective measurements used to investigate the mechanisms through which interventions produce behavioral change? So Nancy, I see Andrea's typing.
Well, I think this is such a great question, and I
Hmm.
my answer is it depends. But I think on a couple levels, right? We might have different definitions of objective measurement is one. One, it depends, but another is I think it depends substantively on what one is focusing on, but I think the answer is that yes, objective measurements absolutely are and can be used. They're not always available. And I think that's what the big challenge is. And I also think that objective measurements can, in many contexts, be paired with subjective assessments to give us additional information, depending upon what the question is. So that's my thought. I think it's a wonderful question, but I'm excited to hear what Nancy and Joe think as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think some of the measures that we shared earlier are examples of some objective measures that have been used. So, but I like
Yeah.
your idea of combining them with subjective measures.
Yeah, and I think Nancy, you could probably speak to this as well as anyone, given that you chaired, I think, a division of biobehavioral health at University of
Mhm.
Pennsylvania School of Nursing,
Mhm.
right? And I mean, I guess and again, I realize this doesn't encompass all objective measures, but when that question is asked, the first thing that jumped to mind are biological measures
Mhm.
of processes that could then be incorporated as mechanisms, say, that are linked to subjective outcomes or something similarly.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
mean, I think those are very powerful models to test albeit very challenging to demonstrate because, again, in one way, I think if you can demonstrate the link, a compelling link empirically between a biological measure, or even a behavioral measure, and then say a more subjective outcome, those are very compelling results, but I think fairly rare. At
Mm,
least in the science I'm familiar with, say dementia care science,
mm.
challenging to establish. But again, it also would suggest if you do have that result and you're fairly confident in, for example, the efficacy of an intervention on, say, a biological mechanism, biological measure of a mechanism to a subjective outcome, it also suggests, I think, perhaps very potentially powerful validity too. So,
Other
yeah, I
than the
mean,
stress process model, I think, where we have seen measures of salivary cortisol or other measures of biological stress being used,
yeah.
where salivary measures can be more easily obtained in the natural environment.
Yeah. But I mean, I think you could also think of things, Nancy, like say clinical assessments of some
Hmm.
kind. If one believes those are objective, I mean, that certainly could be one example too. Um,
Hmm.
monitoring data, observation, like using monitoring again, that'll be a topic we'll be getting to in one of the
Yep.
later guidance documents. Those would be other potential examples, unobtrusive measures of
Hmm.
function. So I mean, there's a lot out there that could be considered in this context of mechanistic testing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Great
yeah, great,
question.
great question. So the other question we have here is from Wanjin. Thanks, Wanjin, for being here. One question she has is really another really good one related to measurement. If we don't have validated measures on some mechanisms that we've identified through formative research literature review, can we still target those mechanisms in a pilot study? Say, for example, a grant proposal using self-created survey questions. So, what
Hmm.
do you think, Andrea? Nancy?
Yeah.
Yeah, really
I
interesting.
mean, I think the answer is yes. Yes, mechanisms can and should be explored, and that there are so many different strategies. In a pilot is one way, and sometimes I think it depends a little bit about what else do you know about the intervention, what else do you know about the outcome of interest, and is another good step learning more about the mechanism through interviews or observations first. Sometimes when that's the case, you have an idea about a mechanism, and maybe you don't have a validated measure. Maybe you also want particularly in a grant proposal, some additional compelling evidence that supports the idea that this is a really good mechanism to go after. And it's so promising, even though we don't have validated measures, here's some other information, other data that support the likely utility of investigating
Hmm.
this mechanism. That's another
Hmm.
strategy that would come to mind. Because I see the question mentions a grant proposal. I think that would strengthen that argument. But
Hmm.
yes, absolutely, things can be explored. It will be imperfect as with every study. And then I think you think about what you can do to counter that limitation. What will be done in the next step? If you have promising results, what other measures can you use for similar constructs? Those are some things that I would think about that might be useful to work in.
Maybe one strategy one could use, Andrea, if possible. And again, within a smaller scale pilot study, maybe the resources aren't necessarily there, but I think there are probably ways to do it. Is maybe you use it as an opportunity to simultaneously, one, pilot out the effects of an intervention on a given mechanism. But then number two, collect additional data to further strengthen the measurement of the mechanistic construct itself, if that makes sense, Wanjin. So almost doing it simultaneously. And I think within the context of a pilot study, you might be able to make the case that in addition to piloting the intervention itself, piloting the potential effects of the intervention on a given mechanism is we're also going to use this pilot phase to strengthen the underlying measurement of the mechanism itself, vis-a-vis phase content validity. You could make an argument if the intervention is influencing the mechanism, you show an empirical association, that is some demonstration of construct validity, and kind of couching it in those terms and that strategy, that could be one other way to do it too, rather than simply saying, well, there's no measures. I'm going to provide 5 Likert items or something. And as a reviewer, as a reviewer likely will potentially critique that because you're opening yourself up for those critiques versus saying we understand there aren't good measures of this mechanism. We're going to use the opportunity in this pilot resources to strengthen that too. So great.
I really like Joe's suggestion. I was just going to add to that. What I think would be so exciting about that is if you can investigate the mechanism in the context of the pilot study, like the downside of just creating and using a simple item is like it could be a great mechanism, but you just wouldn't get enough data about it. And you'd miss the opportunity to know that it indeed is a viable mechanism. And another thing that I think we'll see proposed is in the context of a pilot talking to people who were involved in that study and probing around that mechanism or related mechanisms so that even if you don't get sufficient information that um, is potent enough to demonstrate, yes, we should keep following this, maybe you get it qualitatively and you just realize I need to actually do more measurement information. I think that as you can see from what was presented, some of the common mechanisms of action that are studied have benefited from so much research. And so we really know a lot about them, but I think it's exciting when people have ideas about new mechanisms. So, like, I think what I'm trying to say is it's okay to also not give up on it too soon and to want to get more information about it. It takes some time to measure mechanisms correctly.
Yes. Hmm.
It's a great point, Andrea. And we also presume that some of the mechanisms we are testing work the same in all populations, and they may not. And so we do want people to challenge those hypotheses and think about how they may work in different populations. So
So we have another interesting question. This is from Stephanie Wilson. How do you think about the appropriateness of looking at preliminary efficacy in pilot studies, which seems to be a source of debate, and the best approach is the sample size projections for proposing full-scale trials? Andrea, Nancy, I can certainly weigh in on this to some extent. Stephanie, I think as you allude to in your question, from my feeling, my understanding, certainly in sitting on review panels, and I think Nancy and Andrea and Laura as well could probably weigh in on this too. I think you're right. I think the field in general, at least the intervention science fields we operate in, have been moving away from this idea of using pilot studies to establish power estimates for a later, larger scale trial. Um, and there's many reasons for that. Again, I would leave it to biostatistical experts, and we certainly have resources on the Embrace webpage to this effect. Another great resource to consider, because it's been a topic of great interest, is in the NIA Impact Collaboratory and the biostatistical core of that collaboratory. Again, if Katie or Robin could put the web link in there for you at least. Thank you, Robin and Katie. But in any event, I think where the field is going vis-a-vis these pilots is really trying when identifying outcome measures for an intervention is trying to identify outcome measures that have established minimally clinically important differences or clinical cutoffs or something similar that have been validated, and then basing your power estimates around that. There are two reasons I think why that's important. One, it ensures that if an intervention demonstrates an empirical effect, a statistically significant effect in a later large scale trial, that effect isn't just statistically significant, it's likely clinically significant too. And that I think is what we're all striving for versus just getting a p less than 0.05. Okay. Um, and I think the other reason too is some of the challenges of utilizing a pilot trial in and of itself to have accurate, valid estimates of of efficacy to then base a full trial on. It could perhaps result in less efficient use of resources on a larger scale trial, et cetera. So, Stephanie, hopefully that helps. But I mean that's my sense of where things have been going. Nancy, Andrea, not sure if you feel the same way, but
I do, Joe, and I thank you for that very clear answer.
yeah.
I think all I would add is I think another thing to think about with this is I think the sensitivity of your outcome measure is equally important when you like you want to have as many things working in your favor as you can as you prepare. And I think that that's something that gets overlooked a lot. I think when we're thinking about sample size estimations, so much of that is contingent. I think really considering and providing also good evidence for why your outcome measure is sufficiently sensitive, I think is what I'm trying to say is something that's often missing, that runs in parallel and is equally important. They go hand in hand, I think. It's a really good question.
We have another question here from Katie Abbott. Thank you for this discussion. I'm frustrated by the relatively few standardized positive caregiver outcome measures. I'm also thinking about foundational communication skills as precondition to any intervention where you are hoping to improve relationship quality. Does that seem accurate? Again, really interesting question here. Andrea, Nancy, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a great question. Thinking about component one, I think this is a frustration that many of us share. And I think I'm really glad that you're bringing this point up. We're very often in dementia care interventions trying to address or alleviate negative things, and this is kind of a paradigmatic issue in the field. So that doesn't mean that we can't be looking at positive outcome measures. I do think we need to look at maybe other constructs from other fields that could be used and adapted for some of that, but I would just say that I agree. I think that what you're identifying, does that seem accurate? Yes, that's a problem. Um, and for foundational communication skills as a precondition, um, that might be something where you start thinking about, is that a moderator, depending upon the specific intervention that you're doing? How much is it relying upon communication skills, or acting, influencing communication skill pathways? And is that something that you want to assess as, do you think that would moderate the strength, of an association? Might be a question for that. Um, I don't know that I have a perfect answer for how that gets addressed. I think that lots of things probably fit in that bucket, right? Another one that probably fits is experience that someone has either professionally or personally with dementia prior to this immediate caregiving experience, for example. That's another one that I feel really gets overlooked, but makes a big difference. Like if I was a CNA, oftentimes we see that those people engage really differently in an intervention, but we're not always measuring and looking at those things. Um, those are a few of my thoughts. I think you're raising a great point about
Yeah.
lack of attention to positive outcomes. Um, and so thank you for doing that.
No, it's really interesting. Katie or Robin, if you have a chance, could you put up the causal pathway diagram again? Because Katie's question uh, is raising a lot of thinking in my mind. And so, Katie, what's interesting is I totally agree with all of Andrew's insights related to the positive outcomes and where we're at as a field. The other interesting thing you raise a precondition. And again, it is rare in a lot of our work where I think we fully explicate preconditions for an intervention actually to take place, number one. Now maybe I'm missing it and it's just operationalized in a different way, maybe as like an eligibility criterion or something. But you had mentioned foundational communication skills and and trying to think through what would an intervention, how would you describe that in your intervention? Is it essentially people have to come to the intervention with a certain set of foundational communication skills in order to actually participate? Or do you actually create almost a multi-component intervention approach where I'm almost thinking of something like a smart design, where essentially the foundational communication skills are what in a smart design would be called a potentially tailoring variable, where let's say you have participants in an intervention for a certain period of time where the focus is on the foundational communication skills. Once participants or a group of participants reach that precondition, then maybe they're randomly assigned into whichever your actual intervention groups were, what you expected. Now, if certain participants do not reach that foundational communication skill, again, they can then be re-randomized into other approaches to help further establish that, something along those lines. I know it's hard to speak it out rather than draw it out, but when I think of the causal pathway and precondition and what you described, that's what I think. Um, I don't know if others feel the same way, but
I guess that's what I'm hearing, Katie. saying that's the direction. I almost wish we had an ability to go back and forth with Katie, but that's how I read her question, is that that's a direction she is thinking of going. And I believe, I guess, if it is a precondition, then that's what people need to reach before they can go further.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
which I think we know from experience, right? That's what families need. At least they have to have some foundational knowledge. Because it's the same with other dementia interventions where people are not prepared with even basic understanding of dementia. And
Right.
before they can go any further, they really need to understand what is dementia before we can go into neuropsychiatric symptoms or other skill
Yeah.
building, right? So there's many other parallels within a lot of our work.
And what I think is interesting, Nancy, is do we actually describe that in our
Right.
interventions?
Mhm.
And I don't think we do. I mean, it's just kind of assumed where we're just going to enroll people and there might be eligibility criteria and those kinds of things, but those are often screening for people maybe at a certain stress level or depression,
Mhm.
whatever that is. But
Right.
in terms of those important preconditions, in order to actually
Mhm.
engage and act with the intervention, which again, we'll be talking about in the fidelity and mechanism guidance document, will be very, very interesting.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think we do that enough. And to me, it's important that we really think through that more.
I don't
Um,
necessarily see it as a mechanism though, right? I see it as,
no, but a
yeah,
precondition, yeah, which is,
right.
and again, and what I'm saying is, I rarely ever come across a dementia care intervention, for example, that ever talks about a precondition.
Mhm.
I rarely see it. Maybe someone else has, but I haven't. So,
Mhm.
I guess I think of preconditions, I agree. I don't commonly see them. I guess I think of this issue just thinking of the realities of the variability and where people are coming from, and maybe it's something that can be like put to the test. And that's why I was thinking of it as, do you want to think about that as a moderator where you measure what are their communication skills? And like, does it make a difference? Like, do they actually engage and benefit differently in the intervention or not? Like, is that in and of itself a question that can be examined? When I think of preconditions, I think of things like, you know, um, if you're working with folks and decision making at end of life, like you need to be at a certain point in where you are with your power of attorney and whether it's activated or not, or whether you're at the
mhm, yeah,
stage where, not so much eligibility criteria, but like, you're at a stage of readiness where like, you're going to need a power of attorney, or things of that nature. But I have not thought of it really as preconditions. And I think maybe there are different ways that these things can be addressed, but we're
yeah,
seeing, how complex and nuanced it is. And I agree with Nancy, this is like one example, and there are probably so many other examples of things that fit into this bucket, um,
definitely.
that could be considered. Thank you. It's a wonderful question.
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. Well, everybody, I think this is a wonderful discussion. Great questions. Um, so appreciate Dr. Hodgson, Dr. Gilmore Bykowski, Dr. Gitlin, and of course, uh, Robin Berglund and Katie Luagi as well. On behalf of all of us from Embrace, thanks for joining our webinar today. We'll be sharing with you both an opportunity to evaluate the webinar. We'd appreciate if you do that. And then also, please be on the lookout for our guidance documents. Our first guidance document on mechanisms themselves are now available, as well as the subsequent other three. And we'll be following these up with webinars or other exciting learning and outreach opportunities. So please do engage with us. Feel free to ask us any questions. We're happy to help in any way we can. Otherwise, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time today.
Take care.